When Silas Calloway died at 89, his three grandchildren drove separate cars to a lawyer's office in Ardell, Kansas, to hear how a quiet man had divided 89 years of living. Wade, the eldest, inherited the farmhouse and the 240 acres of wheat ground that came with it. Bree, the middle one, received the savings and the pickup truck. Ruth, the youngest, the one who had moved back to a dying town at 38 and spent 6 years lifting her grandfather in and out of a bathtub, received a single line on a single page. One decommissioned water tower and the quarter-acre of caliche dirt beneath it, on the dead end of Spurlock Road, appraised value $1. Her brother said it sounded about right. Her sister didn't argue. Ruth drove out to the tower alone the following week, expecting nothing but rust and pigeon mess and the dry rattle of a town the highway had forgotten. She found the brick pump house at the base of the legs. The padlock somebody had oiled within the last month, and behind a steel door painted the same flat gray as everything else. She found the thing Silas Calloway had spent 50 years building in the dark. The lawyer's office sat above the old Ardell feed store, up a flight of stairs that smelled of dust and warm pine. 3 chairs faced the desk. Ruth took the middle one out of habit, the way she had taken the middle of everything her whole life. Wade sat on her left in a charcoal suit that did not belong in a town of 311 people. Bree sat on her right, turning her car keys over and over in her fingers, a small metallic ticking that filled the room. The lawyer's name was Renner. He opened a thin folder and set his reading glasses low on his nose. "Your grandfather kept it simple," Renner said. "Simpler than most. But he was particular about one thing, and I'll get to that." Wade laid his phone face down on his knee. Renner read the farmhouse first. The white clapboard house on County Road 9, the porch where May Calloway had snapped green beans into a chipped enamel bowl for 40 summers, the 240 acres that still grew hard red winter wheat when the rain cooperated, all of it to Wade. Wade nodded once, slowly the nod of a man receiving what he had already counted on. "That tracks," he said. "I'm the one who can actually manage farm ground." Nobody asked whether anyone else might have wanted to learn. Renner read the savings next. $16,040 in a credit union account and a 2009 Ford F-150 with 182,000 miles on the odometer, all to Bree. Bree stopped turning the keys. "Okay," she said, and started turning them again. Then Renner paused. He looked at Ruth over the top of his glasses, and something passed across his face, a flicker she couldn't name, almost like a man bracing for a thing he didn't want to deliver. "To my granddaughter Ruth," he read, "I leave the standpipe water tower and the parcel beneath it, Lot 4 of Block 11, Spurlock Road, Ardell Township, appraised tax value $1. 6 years of her life. They had weighed it and stamped it at a single dollar. If you're the kind of person who's ever given years to someone who couldn't say thank you, stay with me, because what that dollar was really worth is the whole reason I'm telling you this story." Wade leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "That's the whole thing, the old tower?" "That's what your grandfather wrote," Renner said. Ruth looked at the page in the lawyer's hands. At the bottom she could see the signature, the long looping C she had watched form 10,000 times, shakier now than she remembered but unmistakably his. He had signed the will 14 months before he died, back when his right hand still answered him. Well, Bree slid her keys into her purse and zipped it shut. "I'm sure Grandpa had a reason." Wade stood and buttoned his jacket. "Look, Ruth, it's what he wanted. You knew Grandpa. He wasn't trying to slight anybody. A tower's a tower." He said it gently, which was worse than if he'd said it cruelly, because it meant he believed it. Ruth stayed in her chair. Her brother and her sister walked out together, and she heard them in the stairwell already talking, low and quick, about flights and closing dates and a man named Stoss who could handle the deed transfer on the house. The door at the bottom clicked shut. Their footsteps faded across the gravel lot. Renner waited until the building went quiet around them. Then he took off his glasses and set them on the folder. "Miss Calloway," she looked up. "Your grandfather came in here in person to write that line. Most of my clients fax me a list. He drove 40 minutes each way and sat in that exact chair, and he made me read the water tower clause back to him 3 times until I had the lot number exactly right." Renner studied her. "I asked him if he wanted to add anything, an explanation, a note for the family. He said, each of them is getting what they're able to hold. What does that mean?" I asked him the same thing. Renner shrugged, but it wasn't careless. "He said I'd understand later, and that you'd understand first." Ruth walked out into the flat white light of a Kansas afternoon. Wade's rental was already gone. Bree was standing by the F-150 she'd just inherited, sunglasses on, phone to her ear, and when she saw Ruth, she lowered the phone but not the glasses. "Ruthie, I know it's not what you pictured. I didn't picture anything, Bree. It's just." Bree shifted her weight. He was 90. His head wasn't right at the end. You said yourself he was getting confused. He probably just forgot to fix it. He wrote it 14 months ago. He drove himself to do it. Ruth heard her own voice come out even and tired. He was himself, Bree. He just wasn't who you wanted him to be. Bree opened her mouth, closed it, put her phone back to her ear, and got in the truck. Ruth stood on the gravel until the engine noise dwindled down Main and out toward the on-ramp, and then there was only the wind moving across the empty lot and the long metal groan of the elevator down by the rail spur, leaning into a gust the way it had leaned for 70 years. She had come back to Ardell 6 years earlier, the spring her grandfather fell. She'd been 38 then, living in a one-room studio above a print shop in Wichita, running a hand-lettering business out of the same room she slept in. Sign painting, mostly. Gold leaf storefront windows, the names of family law firms in old-fashioned shaded serifs, the occasional ghost sign a developer wanted to look authentically aged. It was not much of a living. She had a brush kit her first teacher had left her, a chair with a torn seat, and a man named Theo who came by on Thursdays with takeout and stayed most weekends. A small life, but it was hers, stitched together by her own two hands. Then Wade called on a Tuesday in March to say Silas had fallen off the back porch step and broken his hip, that someone needed to figure out a plan, and that he himself was 3 weeks out from the biggest commercial deal of his career. Ruth drove to Ardell that Friday, meaning to stay the weekend. She stayed 6 years. The first year was the easy one, though she didn't know to call it easy until the others came. The hip healed badly and left Silas with a cane and a careful sideways way of moving through the farmhouse, but his mind was a steel trap and his hands were sure, and in the evenings he sat at the kitchen table and asked her about lettering, about brush pressure and stroke order, about why a capital R wanted a different foot than a capital K. She had thought he was making conversation. She understood now that he was the only person in her life who ever asked about the actual work. She took a part-time job at the county clerk's office in the next town over, 22 miles each way, filing deeds and issuing dog licenses. She cooked. She drove Silas to the cardiologist in Great Bend. She kept the books for the farm because Wade lived in Wichita and Bree lived in Denver, and there was no one else. The second year, Silas's heart began to fail in slow stages, and a small stroke in November took the strength from his right side and most of the sureness from his right hand. Ruth came into the kitchen one morning and found him at the table with a pen, trying to write a grocery list, and the letters came out broken and reversed, the C he had signed his whole life collapsing into a shape he couldn't recognize. He set the pen down very carefully. He did not say anything, but she saw the thing move behind his eyes, a grief deeper than the body, and she understood without being told that for Silas Calloway, losing his right hand was not like losing the strength to walk. It was like losing a language. She didn't know yet how right she was. The third year and the fourth blurred together the way years do when every day is the same day. She bathed him when he could no longer manage the tub alone, and she learned to do it in a way that left him his dignity. Talking about the wheat price while she worked, never letting her face show what it cost either of them. She slept across the hall with the door open, listening for the soft thump of the cane, finding the floor at 2 in the morning. Wade called the first Sunday of every month. The call never changed. "How's the old man?" "Failing, Wade." A pause. "That's rough. I wish I could get out there more." "Then get out here more." "I've got 2 deals in escrow you don't even want to know." She did not want to know. He came at Thanksgiving and stayed one night. Bree sent money, twice in 6 years. A card with a printed verse and a check, $500 the first time, and $300 the second, no note in her own hand either time. Ruth spent both on a shower chair, the grab bars she screwed into the studs herself, and a blood thinner that cost more than her car payment. Nobody else offered anything, and she stopped expecting them to, which is its own kind of injury. The day you stop expecting. Silas died on a Thursday in October at home, in the bed he and May had shared since 1961, with Ruth holding his left hand because his right one no longer held back. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. Ruth nodded and didn't argue, but she thought peaceful was a strange word for the end of a man who had spent his last 2 years unable to write his own name, and she did not say so, because there was no one in the room left to say it to. If you've come this far into Ruth's story, Stay with me, because what she found behind that steel door is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Wade flew in for the funeral and Bree drove up from Denver. They wore black. They cried real tears at the graveside, because grief is real even in people who were not there for the dying. They were gone inside 48 hours, Wade to a closing and Bree to a sales conference in Phoenix. And then Ruth was alone in a farmhouse that still smelled of liniment and burnt coffee, with nothing to show for 6 years but a water tower she couldn't bring herself to look at. 2 weeks passed before she drove out to it. She told herself she was busy, that the deed paperwork came first, that there was no hurry on a rusted standpipe at the end of Spurlock Road. But the truth was, she was afraid of it. The way you're afraid of the last room in a house where someone has died. And on a gray Wednesday morning when the silence of the farmhouse became unbearable, she got in the car and drove out anyway. Because the tower was the last thing in Ardell that still had her grandfather's fingerprints on it. Spurlock Road dead-ended a half-mile past the rail spur, where the pavement gave up and turned to caliche, and the caliche turned to a pair of wheel ruts, running through brome grass, gone the color of straw. The water tower stood at the end of it, a standpipe design, the old kind, a tall cylinder of riveted steel on 4 splayed legs, 50,000 gallons it had held in its working life, Ardell painted down the side in letters 6 feet tall, and faded now to the gray of old bone. Ruth stood at the foot of the legs, the wind pushing her hair across her face. The tank loomed overhead, ticking faintly as the morning sun warmed the steel. A meadowlark sang somewhere out in the brome, 3 rising notes and a fall. The town had built the tower in 1951 and run the whole community off it until 1998, when Ardell hooked into the regional rural water district and it went dry and silent. The county had wanted it down. Demolition would have cost $11,000 the township did not have, and so in 2001, Silas Calloway bought the tower and the quarter-acre under it for $1, on the condition he assumed the liability, and everyone in town thought it the strangest thing the old man had ever done. She had stood here before, she realized. As a girl, maybe 7. Silas used to park the truck in the shade of the legs on Saturday mornings and give her a thermos cup of root beer and a coloring book, then disappear into the little brick building at the base of the tower for an hour, sometimes 2. When he came out, he smelled of paper and ink and the cool mineral closeness of a shut room. "What do you do in there, Grandpa?" "Bookkeeping for the town, mostly." He'd ruffle her hair, boring grown-up stuff. A man needs a quiet place to think. She had believed him. Children believe the rhythms of the adults who love them without ever asking why. It is only later, when there is no one left to ask, that you understand how little you knew. The pump house was 12 feet square, red brick gone soft and rounded at the corners, with a flat poured concrete roof and a single steel door. There was no window. The door had a heavy hasp and a brass padlock, and when Ruth fit the key the lawyer had given her into the lock, it turned with a smooth, oiled click. Somebody had cared for this lock, recently. The shackle had a film of fresh oil on it that came away on her thumb. She pushed the door open and the smell reached her before her eyes adjusted. Not the wet concrete and rust she expected. Paper. Old paper and ink and beeswax, and underneath it the faint mineral cool of a room that the prairie heat never fully reached, the exact smell that had clung to her grandfather's shirt on 100 Saturday mornings. She stood in the doorway with her heart going strange in her chest, and she waited for her eyes to make sense of the dark. The pump and the pipes were gone. Silas had ripped them out decades ago. In their place, he had built a room. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with shelving, plain pine boards he had clearly milled and hung himself, and the shelves were full of boxes. Banker's boxes, shoe boxes, cigar boxes, hundreds of them, each one labeled along the edge in a tight, careful hand and pencil with years. 1971 to 1974, 1975, spring 1980. A long counter ran along the back wall under a hooded work lamp, and on it sat a black underwood typewriter with the keys worn pale, a green-shaded banker's lamp, a coffee can full of dip pens and pencils sharpened to stubs, and 3 stacks of paper squared so precisely the edges might have been cut by a machine. Against the side wall stood a small wood stove and a battered chalkboard on an easel, and on the floor before the chalkboard, 4 mismatched kitchen chairs, arranged in a half circle, facing it, like a classroom that had let out for the day and would meet again tomorrow. Ruth stepped inside. The concrete floor had a rug on it, a braided oval gone thin in the center where feet had crossed it for 50 years. She walked the shelves, reading the labels, and the dates ran backward and forward through her childhood, and a time before any of them, the whole long span of a man's secret hours. She pulled a box down at random. 1986, the label said. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each one a sheet of carbon paper backed by a tissue-thin copy, the kind you made on a typewriter or by laying carbon under your hand and pressing hard with a pen. She lifted the top one to the light. Dear Tomas, it began in her grandfather's hand. Your mother asked me to write to you because her own eyes are too weak for the small lines now, and she does not want to send you a letter she cannot read back to herself. She says the corn came in good this year, better than the year you left, and that the priest asks after you at Mass. She says you are not to send money. She says it twice, so I am writing it twice. She says to come home when the work lets you and not before, because a mother would rather wait than worry. She made me promise to put down that she is proud of you. I am putting it down, written for Inés Vega by S. Calloway. Ruth set the letter on the counter. Her hands were not quite steady. She lifted the next one and the next. If you've made it this far, do me a favor and subscribe, because what Ruth read in those boxes changed everything she thought she knew about the quiet man who raised her. The letters were all like that, and all different. A man named Earl dictating an apology to a brother he hadn't spoken to in 9 years, the words awkward and stiff and trying so hard you could feel the shame coming off the page. A girl asking a soldier to wait for her. A soldier asking a girl to forgive him for not waiting. A widow writing to the bank in Great Bend to beg for 60 more days before they foreclosed on the half section her husband had broken with his own hands, and clipped to the copy a note in pencil. They gave her the 60 days. She made the payment on day 58. Silas Calloway had been the town's pen. For 50 years, the people of Ardell who could not read, or could not write, or could manage a little, but not enough to carry the weight of the words that mattered most, had come down Spurlock Road on Saturday mornings and sat in one of the 4 kitchen chairs and told her grandfather what was in their hearts, and he had set it down for them in clean, plain English, and never told a soul. Immigrants who had crossed 3 borders to cut wheat. Old farmers who had quit school at 9 and carried the secret of their illiteracy like a stone at the chest for 60 years. Wives writing the letters, their husbands were too proud to admit they couldn't. He wrote love letters and death notices and appeals to courts and applications for citizenship, and one, dated 1994, that was nothing but a list of recipes a dying woman wanted written down for a daughter who lived too far to come, so the daughter would have her mother's hand to cook from after she was gone. And it was more than letters. Ruth understood that when she crossed to the chalkboard. Faint under a half-erased lesson, she could still read the ghost of a sentence, written large and simple. The rain is good for the wheat. And below it the same sentence broken into syllables, and below that a row of capital and lowercase letters drilled over and over. The patient repetition of a man teaching grown adults, in the dark, in secret, the thing they had been ashamed their whole lives to admit they'd never learned. He had taught the town to read. Not openly, never openly, because the people who came to him would have died before they let their neighbors see them sounding out a primer at 50 years old. He had given them a room with no window, and a door that locked, where a grown man could fail at the letter B for the 9th time, without anyone watching, and try again. Ruth sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, the way the others must have, and looked at the chalkboard, and cried in a way she had not let herself cry at the funeral. Not for the loss of him, for the size of him. On the counter beside the typewriter sat a row of leather-bound ledgers, 12 of them, their spines worn soft. She opened the first. It was not money, it was names. A name, a date, and a single line describing the work. Inés Vega, letter to son Tomas, Detroit, Nov, 1986. Earl Pruitt, apology to brother Roy, paid me in eggs, told him to keep the eggs. Mrs. Stutzman, reading lesson 41, can now read the seed catalog on her own, cried, so did I. Thousands of names. A ledger of a kind no bank has ever held, a precise and dated account of every private burden one man had quietly helped another human being carry, with no charge and no acknowledgement ever sought. At the bottom of the last ledger, in the most recent ink, the entries grew shorter and the handwriting grew worse, the C beginning to collapse the way it had collapsed on the grocery list, and then they stopped. The final entry was dated 2 years before he died. It read only, hand failing, find someone to keep it going. He never had. Ruth closed the ledger and pressed her palm flat against the cover. The leather was warm from her own hands. Out past the steel door, the wind moved through the brome and the meadowlark sang its 3 notes and a fall, and she sat a long time in the chair where the town had unburdened itself for half a century, holding the record of it against her chest. The writing desk at the end of the counter was smaller than the rest and more carefully made, the one piece of furniture he had clearly built with extra care. It had a tilted writing surface, 3 dovetailed drawers, small brass pulls. She opened the top drawer. A second key lay inside and a bundle of envelopes tied with brown jute string. The envelopes were not addressed to anyone in town. They were addressed to her, AG 7, Ruth AG 16, Ruth AG 25, Ruth AG 38. 4 of them in his careful hand, the dates of a granddaughter's life written across the front in the same ink as the letters he had written for everyone else. Her hands went still. She untied the string. She opened the first. A single sheet, folded twice. Ruth, you are 7 years old today and you don't know I am writing this because you are asleep in the back seat of the truck with root beer on your chin. This morning you sat outside the pump house. You got bored and you found a flat rock and a piece of chalk in my coat. And when I came out, you had written your whole name on the concrete. All 4 letters. Backward and crooked, but every one of them there. You looked up at me and you said, I made my name, like you'd built a house. Most children learn their letters and forget the wonder of it inside a week. You looked at those 4 shapes like you had pulled them out of the air. I knew right then you and I were the same kind of animal. Happy birthday, Ruthie. Grandpa Ruth set it down. She breathed. She opened the second. Ruth, you are 16 and your mother's you spent own money. The money you earned painting the Dairy King window that summer on a set of lettering brushes from a catalog. Sable hair. $41. She thinks it was foolish for a girl who'll grow out of it. I drove 40 miles to the art store in Hutchinson and bought the same set so that when you grow out of it, like she says, I'll have proof that you didn't. You won't grow out of it. People who love the shape of a letter the way you and I do don't grow out of it. We just get quieter about it. Happy birthday. Grandpa, she wiped her face on her sleeve and opened the third. Ruth, you are 25 and you have moved to the city to make signs by hand in an age when a machine can do it cheaper and faster. And your father, God rest him, told you at Christmas that you ought to learn computers and get a real trade. I watched your face go flat the way it does when you've decided not to fight. So let me say what he couldn't. There is a difference between a thing that is made and a thing that is made by a hand, and the difference is the whole reason any of it is worth anything at all. A machine can copy a letter. It cannot mean one. Keep meaning them. Happy birthday. Grandpa the fourth was thicker. She had to take a breath before she could open it. Ruth, you were 38 today, and you spent the day driving me to Great Bend for a heart I was promised would last me 5 more years and didn't even give me one. You think I didn't notice that you turned 38 on a Tuesday in the cardiac waiting room with a vending machine coffee and that nobody called, and that you didn't say a word about it. I noticed. I have always noticed you, Ruthie, which is the loneliest thing I can tell you because you have spent your whole life being the one nobody notices, the one in the middle, the one who can be counted on so completely that everyone stops counting. You gave up a man named Theo and a life in the city and a business you built with your own 2 hands to come and lift an old man in and out of a bathtub, and you did it without once making me feel the weight of it. There is a room you don't know about yet. It is at the end of a road that goes nowhere. I am going to leave it to you and only you, and I am going to make sure it looks like it's worth nothing. Because the people who measure things, Liz, will leave it alone, and the only person I want walking through that door is the one who will understand what it's actually worth. Happy birthday, Ruthie. The door's been yours since you wrote your name on the concrete. I just needed time to fill it. Grandpa Ruth pressed the letter against her chest and bowed her head over the little desk her grandfather had built. In the room her grandfather had hidden, and she stayed that way until the column of light from the open door had crawled all the way across the braided rug and climbed the far wall. When she lifted her head, she saw a 5th envelope still in the drawer. Smaller than the others, no age written on it. Just 2 words. Go see Hollis. If these letters are getting to you the way they got to Ruth, take a second to subscribe, because the man that envelope sent her to had been keeping her grandfather's secret for 50 years. Hollis Brandt was 81 years old and had carried the rural mail out of Ardell for 38 years before the route got folded into Great Bend and he was made to retire. He lived in a low brick house behind the shuttered Methodist church. And, when Ruth knocked, he opened the door before her knuckles left the wood, as though he had been standing on the other side of it for 2 weeks. You found the room, he said. It was not a question, you knew. I'm the one oiled that lock, child. Every month, like he asked me to, since the day he couldn't drive out there himself anymore. Hollis stepped back to let her in. His front room was small and immaculate, smelling of pipe smoke and Murphy's oil soap, and on the wall above the couch hung a framed map of the old mail route, every farm marked in a young man's careful printing. "Sit, you'll want coffee. You've got the look of a person who's been crying in a cold room all morning." He brought 2 cups, black, and sat across from her in a recliner that had molded itself to him over the years. "How long did you know?" Ruth asked. "Since the beginning of it, near enough. I delivered every one of those letters, didn't I? A man writes letters for 40 families, and somebody's got to carry them to the box." He sipped his coffee. "And I was one of his pupils, before I was his mail carrier. I came up in the Dust Bowl. My daddy pulled me out of the 3rd grade to chop cotton, and I could not read a road sign when I was a grown man with a mail route I was supposed to be running." He said it plainly, without flinching, the way only an old man at peace with himself can. "Silas taught me in that room. Took him most of a winter. First letter I ever read all the way through by myself was the one my own wife wrote me when I was overseas, that I'd had to ask a chaplain to read me at the time. Read it 20 years late, sitting in that pump house, and Silas just sat there and let me take as long as I needed." Ruth held her coffee and didn't drink it. "Why did he hide it?" she asked. "A thing like that. Why not let the town know what he did for it?" Hollis was quiet for a moment, turning his cup in his hands the way her grandfather used to turn a pen before he chose the first word. "2 reasons," he said finally. "The first one's the soft one. The people who came to him would have stopped coming if anybody knew. You don't understand the shame, child, not being able to read, in a town where everybody thinks everybody else can. It eats a person. The whole gift of that room was that it had no window and the door locked from the inside, and a man could be 60 years old and not know his letters, and not one living soul would ever find out. The second somebody put up a sign that said free reading lessons, that room died. So he made it look like nothing. Bookkeeping for the town, he'd say. Boring grown-up stuff." Hollis smiled at the floor. "You remember that." Ruth remembered it. Root beer on her chin in the cab of the truck. "And the second reason?" The old man's smile faded. He set his cup down on the side table with a small lick. "The second reason is your brother," he said. "If you're still here, hit subscribe. Because this is where the people who never came home decided they wanted what they never earned." Hollis got up, slower than he used to, and went to a green metal filing cabinet in the corner that was older than Ruth. He worked the bottom drawer open and reached into the back and drew out a thick manila envelope, sealed all the way around with clear packing tape, gone yellow at the edges with age. Her grandfather's handwriting marched across the front. "For Ruth. To be opened only after she has found the room on her own. He brought me this about 3 years before he passed," Hollis said, holding it but not yet giving it over. "Made me promise 3 things, and I'm an old man and a man of my word, so I kept all 3. Don't open it, don't give it to a single living soul but you, and don't put it in your hand until you'd found that room yourself, with nobody leading you to it." He looked at her steadily. "I could have walked you out there the day after the funeral, Ruth. Saved you 2 weeks of grieving in that empty farmhouse. He told me not to. He said, if she won't go look at a thing I left her, then I was wrong about her, and she doesn't need what's in the envelope." The old man's mouth twitched. He wasn't wrong about much. He wasn't wrong about you. He held it out. She took it. It was heavier than paper had any right to be. "There's a thing in there about your brother and your sister," Hollis said quietly. "He read it to me before he sealed it. Said it was the hardest thing he ever wrote, and he wrote 30,000 letters for other people. So that's saying something. You'll know when to use it." Ruth did not open the envelope in Hollis's front room. Some things you do not open in front of another person, even a kind one. She carried it to her car and drove back to the farmhouse, and she did not open it that night either. She set it on the kitchen table where her grandfather had asked her about the foot of a capital R, and she was not ready, and the next morning she drove out to the tower instead. Because the room had begun to feel more like home than the house did. She spent 3 days out there. She read the ledgers cover to cover, the whole half-century catalog of a town's hidden wounds and the man who'd stitched them, and somewhere in the second day she stopped reading them as a marvel and started reading them as an inheritance. She swept the braided rug out into the brome and beat it against the tower leg until the dust rose gold in the slanting light. In the bottom drawer of the desk, she found a list in her grandfather's failing hand, names with question marks beside them. Letters left unfinished, and she felt the weight of everyone. And on the 3rd afternoon, her phone rang in the cool dark of the pump house, and the screen said Wade. Ruthie. His voice was light, casual, the voice he used when he wanted something and was pretending he didn't. Hey, quick thing. I'm going through Grandpa's farm files for the deed transfer, and I keep running into paperwork on that water tower parcel. Lot 4, Block 11. There's a folder this thick on it. A pause that lasted a half beat too long. So what's actually out there? Ruth looked at the shelves, the thousands of letters, the chalkboard, the ledger of names. The desk with her own name written across 4 envelopes. Pigeons, she said. Rust. Some old bookkeeping junk of Grandpa's. Nothing worth the gas to drive out. The line was quiet for a moment. Bookkeeping junk, Wade said. Old ledgers. Tax stuff. You want it? You can come haul it off. No, another pause. Hey, if you do find anything you know interesting out there, you'll loop me in. Right? We're family. Sure, Wade. He hung up. Ruth set the phone face down on the counter and looked at the room and wondered, for the first time, how long the lie would hold. It held 4 days. On Sunday morning, Wade called back, and this time the lightness was gone. I'm driving out Saturday, he said. Bree's flying into Wichita. I'll grab her at the airport. We'll be at the tower at 10. Wade, I told you there's nothing. Ruth. His voice flattened into the register she'd heard him use on the phone with opposing counsel. The voice of a man who handled commercial leases for a living and had finally read to the bottom of the folder. I've been a broker for 20 years. You know what's in that folder Grandpa kept? An option agreement. A wireless carrier's been after that parcel for 3 years. They want to mount antennas on that tank. The lease they offered is $1,840 a month for a 25-year term, with escalators. He let the number sit. That $1 tower is worth better than $500,000 over the life of the lease, Ruthie. And Grandpa knew it because the option's signed. So quit telling me about pigeons. Ruth sat down slowly in one of the kitchen chairs. That's why he gave it to me, she said, half to herself. That's why it needs to be split 3 ways, Wade said. Same as everything should have been. Look, I'm not trying to be the bad guy here. But you can't tell me Grandpa was in his right mind, hiding a $500,000 asset behind a $1 appraisal and slipping it to one grandkid. That's not a plan. That's confusion. We'll talk Saturday. He hung up before she could answer. Ruth spent Friday night in the pump house in the dark, with the green lamp throwing its small circle of light on the desk. She could lock the door, hide the key, swear there was nothing behind the steel. But Wade would not let it go. Wade had never let anything go in his life. He would hire an inspector, file a petition, demand an accounting of the estate, drag it through the district court in Great Bend until the legal bills outran the asset. He didn't break things. He ground them down. And there was a second thing, a thing she was not proud of, sitting low in her chest like a coal that wouldn't go out. She wanted him to see it. She wanted Wade to stand in this room, under the lessons still ghosting the chalkboard, and look at what their grandfather had built in the dark with his own 2 hands while his eldest grandson was in Wichita billing $400 an hour. She wanted him to stand inside the actual shape of the man he was about to call confused. Saturday came up overcast and still, the sky the color of unfired clay, the kind of Kansas morning that can't decide whether to rain. If you've made it this far, stay with me. Because what happened when her brother finally walked through that steel door is the heart of everything her grandfather built. Ruth was at the tower by 9:30. She left the steel door standing open and waited in the cool dark, the smell of paper and ink around her, and at 10 o'clock exactly, Wade's rental crunched up the caliche ruts and stopped in the shade of the legs. Bree got out of the passenger side, Wade out of the driver's. He wore a quarter zip and good boots that had never seen a field. Bree had sunglasses pushed up into her hair and her phone in her hand. Morning, Wade said, looking up at the tank, already appraising it, already running the antenna count and the structural load in his head. It's inside, Ruth said. She led them into the pump house. Wade ducked through the steel door and stopped one step in, and she watched his face. She watched the broker arrive first, the eyes flicking over the shelves, cataloging, the involuntary calculation of a man who saw assets the way other people saw weather. And then she watched the broker falter, because there was nothing here to appraise, nothing to sell, no antennas, no lease, just paper, 10,000 sheets of paper, and a chalkboard and 4 kitchen chairs. Bree came in behind him and went still. What is all this? Ruth pulled a box off the shelf. 1986. She set it on the counter and lifted out the top letter and held it out to him. Read it, she said. Wade took it. He read it. She watched him get to the bottom to written for Inez Vega by S. Calloway, and she watched him not understand. He set it down. Okay, so he did people's correspondence. That's sweet, Ruth. But it doesn't change anything. The asset is the parcel and the lease. The paper's just... He wrote letters for people who couldn't read or write, Ruth said. For 50 years. Free, and he taught them their letters in this room with the door locked, so nobody would know they couldn't read in the first place. Hollis Brandt couldn't read a road sign at 40 years old. Grandpa taught him. The man who carried this town's mail for 38 years learned his ABCs as a grown man, in this chair from our grandfather, and not one of us knew. Bree had drifted to the chalkboard. She was reading the ghost of the lesson under the eraser marks. The rain is good for the wheat. Her hand had risen to her mouth. Wade looked at the shelves again, and this time Ruth saw him try, really try, to make the paper add up to something he could hold, and fail. Because it couldn't be held. That was the whole point of it. This is a lot of charity, and I respect it, Wade said. His voice gone careful, lawyerly, building toward the argument he'd driven 400 miles to make. But none of it is what we're here about. The lease is worth $500,000. That's estate property. The will gave you a $1 parcel because Grandpa hid the real value, and a court is going to look at a hidden $500,000 asset gifted to one heir and call it exactly what it is. Undue influence, or incapacity. You were living with him, Ruth. You were the only one here. That doesn't look good for you, and I'm telling you that as someone trying to protect you. There it was, the threat dressed as concern. You think I influenced him, Ruth said. I think you were the only one in the room for 6 years, and now you've got a $500,000 lease, and the rest of us got a farmhouse and a 16-year-old truck. Wade spread his hands. I'm not saying you did anything. I'm saying how it looks. This needs to be split, Ruthie. Evenly. It's the only thing that's fair, and it's the only thing that doesn't end up in front of a judge. Ruth looked at her brother standing in the center of the room their grandfather had poured 50 years into. A room full of work he'd hidden specifically to keep this exact conversation from ever happening. And she felt the coal in her chest go cold and clear. You got the house, Wade. 240 acres. You'll clear $300,000 on it when wheat ground prices come back up. And you know it, because you ran the comps before the funeral. I watched you do it on your phone at the graveside. She kept her voice even. Bree got the savings in the truck. This is what he left me. And he left it to me on purpose, in plain words, 14 months before he died, with a lawyer reading the clause back to him 3 times. He was confused. He was the least confused man I ever met. He built this in the dark for half a century, and not one of us suspected a thing. Does that sound like a confused man to you? She stepped closer. You can't inherit what you never bothered to come look at, Wade. He didn't hide this from you to be cruel. He hid it because he knew that the day you found out it was worth money, you'd be standing right here, saying exactly what you're saying. The room went very quiet. Out past the open door the wind picked up, and a few drops of rain ticked against the concrete roof. Bree spoke from the chalkboard without turning around. Wade, come look at this. I've seen the board, Bree. No, her voice cracked on it. Come look. She had opened the most recent ledger, the one with the failing hand. She was pointing at the second to last page. Wade crossed to her, reluctant, and read where her finger rested. Ruth knew the entry. She had read it a dozen times. Hollis Brandt, finished reading May's wartime letters to me out loud, all of them, said now we're even. We're not even. I owe that man my whole second life. And below it, in the worst of the shaking hand, the next to last thing Silas Calloway ever wrote in the book. Tell Ruthie the desk drawer. Tell her the door was always hers. Wade stood looking at the page for a long time. That's not legal language, Bree, he said, but the fight had gone soft in his voice. That sentiment, it doesn't change the... It changes everything, Bree said quietly, and you know it does. You just don't want it to. Wade straightened. He was a man who, when cornered by his own heart, retreated into procedure. I'll have the firm review the estate, he said. The lease, the gift, all of it. If it's clean, it's clean. If it's not, we fix it. I'm not letting a $500,000 asset go undiscussed because of a chalkboard. Then have them review it, Ruth said. He looked at her, surprised by how little she gave him. She'd spent 6 years lifting a grown man in and out of a bathtub at 2 a.m. Her brother did not frighten her. I'm not letting this go, Wade said. I know, Ruth said. Neither did Grandpa. Wade walked out into the rain. Bree stayed. She was still standing at the chalkboard, one hand flat against the ledger, the other against the slate, as though she could feel the chalk dust of every lesson their grandfather had ever written there. After a moment she said, without turning, he really never told anybody. No. All those years he came out here on Saturdays, and we thought he was just a quiet old man who liked to be left alone. Bree's voice was thick. He wasn't quiet. He was the loudest person in this whole town. He just said it all on paper for other people, where it didn't get him anything. "Yeah," Ruth said. "That's about right." Bree closed the ledger gently. She ran her palm across the cover the way you'd touch the shoulder of someone you'd hurt. Then she walked out into the rain after her brother, and Ruth heard the car doors, and the engine, and the tires on the wet caliche. And then there was only the rain on the roof, and her grandfather's lamp throwing its small circle of light on the desk. If you've stayed with Ruth this long, subscribe and stay, because what was sealed in that manila envelope is the part that finally set all three of them free. Ruth waited 2 more days before she opened the manila envelope. She wanted to be ready, and she was never going to be ready. So on a Tuesday evening, she sat at the kitchen table in the farmhouse, with the lamp on and her grandfather's letters to her spread out in front of her like a hand of cards, and she broke the yellowed tape. 3 things slid out: a stapled legal document on heavy paper, a sealed letter with Watt and Bree written across the front, and a third, single sheet, folded once, with her own name on it. She read the legal document first, because she was afraid of the letters. It was a transfer on death deed for Lot 4, Block 11, naming Ruth E. Calloway as the sole grantee beneficiary, recorded with the Register of Deeds, notarized and witnessed, dated 3 years before Silas died. Clipped behind it was the wireless carrier's option and lease agreement and an assignment, signed and notarized the same day, conveying all rights and revenue under that lease to Ruth upon Silas's death, in consideration of services rendered and care given, and in further consideration of her continuing the use of the parcel for the public benefit at her sole discretion. Behind that was a 1-page sworn statement in which Silas attested, before a notary, that he was of sound mind, that he had prepared the instruments freely with the advice of independent counsel, and that he had excluded his other heirs from this parcel with full knowledge and clear intention. The attorney who'd drawn it up was a woman named Pell, out of Hutchinson, 90 miles away, not Renner. Not anyone Wade would think to ask. Her grandfather had spent his last good years making a wall that no lawyer in the world could climb, around a room that looked like it was worth $1. Ruth set the legal papers aside and reached for the sheet with her own name on it. "Ruth, if you're reading this, you found the room, and you found the 4 letters I wrote you across your life, and Hollis kept his 3 promises. I knew he would. He's the most honest man I ever taught to read a road sign. I'm sorry I didn't tell you while I was alive. There were 100 evenings I almost did, sitting across that kitchen table from you, while you explained the foot of a capital RR to a dying old man who already knew more about letters than he'd ever let on. I wanted to take you out there and hand you the key and watch your face, but I needed to build the wall first. Your brother is good with leases, and your sister is good with people, and the 2 of them together can talk a judge into most anything, and I have spent 50 years watching what money does to families that were getting along fine until it showed up. So I built the wall before I told you about the house behind it. Forgive an old man his secrets. They were the only kind I ever kept, and I kept them for the right people. Everything out there is yours. The lease will pay you better than $1,800 a month, and it'll go up over the years, and it is more money than you have ever had. And I want you to do one thing with it. I want you to keep the room open. I couldn't keep it going. My hand quit on me, and I couldn't find the right person to hand it to, and the truth is, I was waiting for you. And I was ashamed it took me so long to admit that the right person had been sitting in the cab of my truck with root beer on her chin since she was 7 years old. You make letters mean something, Ruthie. That's the whole job. That's the only job. There are still people in this town and the towns around it who carry that stone in their chest, who'd never walk into a library or a soul school, who'd come to a quiet room at the end of a road that goes nowhere if somebody they trusted was sitting in it. Be that somebody. Use the money to be that somebody. You'll be better at it than I ever was, because you won't have to hide. I am proud of you. I was proud of you when you wrote your name on the concrete, and I am proud of you now. The door was always yours. I just needed time to fill the shelves. Grandpa Ruth folded the letter and held it against her chest and breathed until the kitchen stopped blurring. Then she picked up the 3rd envelope, the one addressed to her brother and her sister, and she turned it over in her hands and did not open it. It was not hers to read first. He had taught her that too, in 50 years of letters she'd only just discovered. Some words belong to the person they're written for. And you hand them over, and you don't read them over their shoulder. She called Renner the next morning and asked him to set a meeting. It took 5 days to get all three of them in the same room. Wade flew back in with a junior associate and a folder of his own. Bree drove up from her hotel in Great Bend. They sat in the same 3 chairs in the same order. Wade on the left, Bree on the right, Ruth in the middle, and Renner laid Ruth's documents on the desk and slid them across. These were prepared by independent counsel 3 years ago, Renner said. A transfer on death deed and a lease assignment, both recorded, both notarized, both witnessed. I've confirmed the recording with the Register of Deeds and the Notary's Commission with the state. They're valid. He looked at Wade over his glasses. The transfer on death deed means the parcel passed to Ruth outside the estate the moment your grandfather died. It was never part of the estate to contest, and the assignment carries the lease with it. There's nothing here to split, Mr. Calloway. There's nothing to challenge. He didn't leave you a loophole. He left you a wall. Wade's associate read the deed twice and then leaned over and said something low in his ear. Ruth watched her brother's jaw work. He read the documents himself, fast, the way a man reads filings he's seen 1,000 of, and then he read them again slowly, and she watched the certainty drain out of his shoulders 1 degree at a time. 3 years ago, Wade said. A different lawyer. In Hutchinson. He drove 90 miles each way so you wouldn't be able to find her by asking around town, Renner said. There was no cruelty in it, just fact. He told me once that you were the smartest of his grandkids. I think he meant it as a warning to himself. Wade set the deed down. He pressed his thumb hard against his temple, the way he did when the world refused to arrange itself the way he'd planned. He set this whole thing up, he said quietly. The dollar appraisal, the hidden room, the deed. He made it so there was nothing any of us could do. He looked at Ruth, and for the first time since the first reading of the will, there was something underneath the calculation. Something younger and more wounded. Why? Why would he do all that just to keep us out? Ruth reached into her bag and took out the 3rd envelope, the one with Wadey and Bree across the front in their grandfather's hand, and she set it on the desk between her brother and her sister. He didn't do it to keep you out, she said. He did it to keep the room safe. There's a difference. He wrote you this. It's the last thing he ever wrote you. I haven't read it. Bree reached for it first. She slit the flap with her fingernail and unfolded 2 sheets, covered front and back in the careful hand, and she read the first lines aloud, her voice unsteady, and then she stopped reading aloud and read the rest to herself with her lips barely moving, and when she finished she passed it to Wade without a word and put her face in her hands. Wade read it. Their grandfather had written the way he always spoke, plainly without raising his voice, the same hand that had set down 10,000 other people's hardest words now setting down his own. He told them he loved them, at the top and at the bottom, those 2 lines bracketing everything in between. He told them the truth in the space between. He wrote that he had called Wade the first Sunday of every month for 6 years, and that Wade had answered about half the time and talked about escrow and a car he was thinking of buying, and that when Silas told him his grandfather's heart was failing, Wade had said, "That's rough," and gotten off the phone. He did not editorialize. He just set it down and let the words stand. He wrote that Bree had sent 2 checks in 6 years, totaling $800, and that Ruth had spent both of them on a shower chair and a blood thinner, and that he was grateful for the $800 and would not pretend it was the same as the 6 years. And then he wrote about Ruth. He wrote that she had given up a man named Theo and a business she'd built by hand and a city where people knew her name, that she had come back to a dying town and lifted him in and out of a bathtub at 2 in the morning for 6 years and never once made him feel the weight of it. He wrote that she had turned 38 in a cardiac waiting room and nobody had called. "I love you, both," the letter said near the end, and Ruth could see the line over Wade's shoulder because his hands were shaking. "I love you both, but love does not make a man blind." The house went to Wade because Wade understands a house. The savings went to Bree because Bree understands money. The room went to Ruth because she is the only one of you who would have driven out to the end of that road and walked through that door and understood that the most valuable thing I ever made could not be sold. I'm not angry at you. You have your own lives and Wichita is far and Denver is farther, and none of it was ever simple. But your sister was here. Every day your sister was here. The last line read, "If you don't understand why I did it now, read this letter again in 5 years." Wade set it on the desk. He kept his hand flat on the paper for a long moment, the way he might hold down something that wanted to blow away. He stared at the wall behind Renner's head, and when he finally spoke, the lawyer was gone out of his voice entirely. He knew, Wade said, the whole time. He saw exactly what we were and he wrote, "I love you both anyway." He looked at Ruth. "I'm not going to challenge it. The deed's clean." He stopped and started over, because the deed was not the reason and he knew it. "I should have come home, Ruthie." "Yeah," Ruth said. "You should have." He nodded once. He stood and buttoned his quarter zip out of pure habit, the same gesture he'd made before every argument he'd ever delivered, and then he seemed to realize he had no argument left to deliver, and his hand fell away. He looked at her for one more second. Then he walked out, and his footsteps on the stairs were slower than they'd been the first time, and the associate scrambled to gather the untouched folder and follow him. Bree stayed in her chair. She wiped her face with the heel of her hand and looked at her sister. "He noticed everything," Bree said, "and he never made any of us feel small about it. He could have. God knows he could have." "That wasn't who he was," Ruth said. Bree reached over and took Ruth's hand on the armrest and held it, hard, for a few seconds, and then she let go and gathered her purse and walked out, and Ruth heard her crying quietly all the way down the stairs. Renner waited until the building had gone still. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Your grandfather was a remarkable man," he said. "He wrote letters for people who couldn't write them, and he taught the ones who couldn't read," Ruth said. "He'd want you to put it that plain." Renner smiled for the first time since she'd known him. Fair enough. The wireless carrier's first lease payment landed in Ruth's new account on the 15th of the following month. $1,840. She sat in the pump house and looked at the number on her phone for a long time, and then she put the phone away and started to work. Because the money was not the inheritance. The money was just the thing that finally let her do the inheritance. She did not change the room much. She kept the shelves and the ledgers and the chalkboard and the 4 kitchen chairs. Because the 4 chairs were the shape of the thing, and she did not have the right to improve them. She replaced the green lamp's frayed cord. She brought out her own brushes and her own paints, and on a clean board she lettered a small sign, by hand, in a plain shaded serif her grandfather would have recognized as the same family as his typewriter face. She did not hang it on the building, because a building with no window and a door that locked was the whole gift. She hung it on a fence post at the head of Spurlock Road, where the pavement gave out, low and quiet, where only a person who already knew to look would find it. The reading room, it said, no charge, no questions, Saturdays, and underneath, smaller, ask for Ruth. Hollis helped her get it ready. He brought a percolator and a card table and a box of primers from the closed Methodist church basement, and he mounted a coat hook by the door with his own arthritic hands, and when she tried to pay him for the time, he waved her off the same way her grandfather used to wave off the eggs and the loads of split firewood people tried to give him. "Your grandfather kept me company in this room the better part of a winter, when I was the most ashamed man in Barton County," Hollis said, screwing the hook into the brick. "I owe him more than a coat hook. You're going to take what I can't give him back and give it to somebody else. That's the whole machine. That's how he built it." The first Saturday, nobody came. Ruth sat with the door open and the percolator going and read the seed catalog cover to cover, and told herself it took her grandfather 50 years, and she could give it more than one Saturday. The second Saturday, an old woman came. She parked a quarter-mile back and walked the rest, the way the proud ones do, so her car wouldn't be seen at the end of the road. She had a letter from a granddaughter in Oregon that she'd carried in her purse for 3 weeks, because she couldn't make out the small cursive and was too ashamed to ask anyone in town. Ruth made coffee and read it to her 3 times, slow on the last one so the woman could follow the words with her own eyes, and when the woman left, she took Ruth's hand in both of hers and didn't say anything at all, because some things don't have words, which is the strangest lesson to learn in a room built entirely out of them. By the 5th Saturday there were 4 people. By autumn there were 9, and Ruth was running 2 sessions, and Hollis sat in the corner correcting her chalkboard hand when she got lazy with her descenders. People came to write letters and to read them, and people came who couldn't read at all and would have died before they admitted it anywhere with a window, and Ruth gave them the room with no window and the door that locked and the certainty that not one soul would ever know. She watched grown men and women sound out a primer for the first time in their lives and weep over it, and she understood, finally and completely, what her grandfather had meant when he wrote, "Tell her the door was always hers." The young man came on a Tuesday in November, which was not a Saturday, which meant he'd asked someone, which meant he'd worked up the nerve. If you've stayed with Ruth all the way to here, subscribe before this last part, because this is where her grandfather's 50 years finally became hers. He was maybe 26. He stood in the doorway with a baby carrier in one hand, a sleeping infant strapped into it, and a piece of mail in the other, holding the mail the way you hold a thing that frightens you. He wore a feed store cap and a canvas coat torn at the cuff, and he had the braced posture of a person used to being asked for documents he couldn't fully read. Saw the sign on the fence, he said. It's not Saturday. I know it's not Saturday, He looked at the baby. I got a letter from the county. About the WIC, about my daughter's appointments, and I can read some of it. But there's a part I keep getting wrong, and they keep sending it back. And I don't want to bring her to the clinic on the wrong day again. She's got the ear thing. Ruth set down her brush. She pulled out two of the kitchen chairs and turned them to face each other, the way her grandfather had arranged them 50 years ago, knee to knee, no desk between, nothing to hide behind. Sit down, she said. Bring her in where it's warm. We'll read it together, and then I'll show you how to read the next one yourself. So you don't have to drive out here every time the county sends you something. That's the deal. You don't owe me anything. There's coffee. The young man sat. The baby slept. Ruth read the letter aloud once, plain, and then she put it in his own hands and put her finger under the line that mattered, and read it again with him, slow, and watched him get it. Watched the appointment date arrive in his face like the sun coming up, and she thought about her grandfather's ledger, and the line that read, "Can now read the seed catalog on her own," cried, "So did I." She started a ledger that night, a leather one like his. She wrote the first entry by lamplight at the desk her grandfather built. She did not write the young man's name, because the whole gift was that nobody would ever know, and instead she wrote, read a county letter with a young father, showed him the date. He found his daughter's clinic day on his own the second time through. We're not even. I owe an old man my whole second life. Wade called on a Sunday morning in March. Ruth was on the porch of the farmhouse with a cup of coffee, watching the meadowlarks work the ditch line. Ruthie. His voice was different than she'd ever heard it, stripped of the certainty he'd carried his whole life. I had a deal up in Russell County. On the way back, I took the county road through Ardell, drove past the farmhouse. A pause. The people who bought it put a basketball hoop over the garage. There's kids. There would be, Ruth said. It looked. He stopped. It looked like a place where people lived. It never looked like that when it was ours. A long silence, long enough that she checked the screen. I drove out Spurlock Road, to the tower. I saw your sign on the fence post. Ruth said nothing. She let him get there on his own, the way her grandfather would have. There were 3 cars out there, Wade said. On a Saturday, at the end of a road that goes nowhere. His voice caught. I'm sorry, Ruth. He didn't say for what. He didn't qualify it, didn't soften it into for the lawyer or for coming home or for what I said in Renner's office. He just said the 2 words and let them stand on their own, the way their grandfather had taught a whole town to do. Though Wade had never once sat in that room and would never know that's where the lesson came from. Thank you, Wade, she said. How's it going? The room. Busy. We had 11 last Saturday. 11. She could hear him doing the math he couldn't help doing, and then she could hear him stop, because there was no metric in his whole trade that would price what 11 meant. That's good, he said finally. That's really good. He cleared his throat. I don't want to take your morning. I just wanted to say I think about it. The letter he wrote us. I read it again, like he said. I didn't wait 5 years. What'd it say the second time? He was quiet a moment. Same thing. I just heard it different. A letter from Bree came that same week. 1 page, handwritten, which Ruth understood was the entire point of it. I've read Grandpa's letter 11 times, it said. Every time I get to the part about the 2 checks I have to put it down and walk around the block before I can pick it up again. 2 checks? 6 years. I think I always knew it wasn't enough. It was just easier to write a check than to drive home and sit with a man who was dying one Sunday at a time. You did what I couldn't, or what I wouldn't, which is worse. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just writing it down where you can read it, because you're the one who taught me, this month, what it means when a person writes a thing down instead of just feeling it and letting it pass. You were there. I wasn't. If you ever want to talk, I'm here now. I know that doesn't fix it. Bree. Ruth read it twice. Then she carried it out to the pump house and laid it in the drawer of her grandfather's desk, next to the 4 letters he'd written her across her life, and she added a line to her own ledger. My sister wrote me a letter in her own hand. It was the hardest thing she ever wrote. I am keeping it. The evening light was coming long and gold across the brome when she finished. She stepped outside and locked the steel door and stood at the foot of the tower legs, looking up at the great gray tank with Ardell fading down its side, and near the top, the small dark rectangles of a carrier's antennas on a platform her grandfather had quietly negotiated 3 years before he died. The thing that paid for the percolator and the primers and the gas for the people who came too far to come. Everyone had thought the parcel was worthless until they learned the lease made it worth a fortune. And then they learned the fortune was the smallest thing the tower held. A meadowlark sang out in the grass. 3 rising notes and a fall. Ruth thought about her grandfather, just her grandfather, the man who took her out here on Saturday mornings with a thermos of root beer and told her he was doing bookkeeping for the town. The man who had carried 30,000 of his neighbors' hardest words and never let one of them down. The man who lost his right hand to a stroke and grieved it like a language, because for him it was. The man who watched a 7-year-old write her own name on the concrete in chalk, backward and crooked, and knew and waited 37 years for her to come back and read what he'd left her. The man who built his whole life out of letters and never once needed his name on a single one. She got in her car. The lease money would come on the 5th, the way it always came now, and she would spend it the way he asked her to, and the room at the end of the road that went nowhere would be open on Saturday, the way it had been open for 50 years before her, and would be open, if she had anything to say about it, for 50 after. She drove back toward town under a sky going purple at the edges. Behind her the tower stood against the last of the light, holding nothing anymore that anyone could measure, and the wind moved through the dry grass at its feet, steady and patient and asking for nothing, exactly the way he always had.